right at 3 o'clock. So I think I'll get started. I see there's a few folks still coming in, but just to respect for everybody's time, I think I'll get started. And I'd like to welcome everyone today to the Soil Health Nexus Digital Cafe. We have what I think is going to be a really interesting presentation today. Before we do start that, for any newcomers, I'd just like to talk just for a second on who we are, the Soil Health Nexus. We're a university-led team working to increase the knowledge on soil health and provide extension resources for educators and agency folks. And it's our group represents 12 land-grant universities in the North Central region states. So our format today is we're going to start off with our presenter presenting for about 20 to 30 minutes with a Q&A, and then we'll kind of get the questions answered. Then we'll go into breakout rooms. You'll have an opportunity to pick breakout rooms that you'd like to participate in. We have them listed on the screen, but we want to get everybody's questions answered as quick as we can. So what I'm excited about today is our topic is the long-term effect of cover crops on soil health and crop yield. So it's our friends from the University of Guelph and the Ridgetown Campus has done a lot of work on these long-term studies. And I always like to get the information on long-term studies because we always talk about soil health and impact. So I'd like to welcome our presenter today, Dr. Chahal from, she's a postdoc fellow for the University of Guelph and the Ridgetown Campus. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let her share, maybe introduce herself a little bit. So welcome. We're glad to have you on today.
Thank you. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen, like the presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Yes, I am Inderjot, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Guelph. So I did my PhD in 2019 at the University of Guelph, and I studied the impacts of cover crops and crop residue management on soil health parameters and the crop yields. So my research was also at the University of Guelph, Ridgetown Campus, as when I was doing my PhD, and after that I stayed and started working as a postdoc with Laura Vineyard, who's a faculty member at the University of Guelph. So for today's presentation, I am going to talk a little bit about the long-term effect of cover crops on the soil health properties and also on the crop yield. So just to give you a brief introduction about the long-term experiments that we have at the campus at the University of Guelph. So we have two side-by-side trials, which were separated by a year. So in the background, we are seeing is the 2020 corn, and in the foreground, it will be 2021 corn. So this picture was taken in 2020 in October. So, these experiments are really unique because we don't really have side-by-side comparisons. So I think, in my opinion, they're really powerful experiments where you get a chance to compare them over time. So we have so these experiments were actually, they're long-term because they have been established in 2007, and we have an adjacent site that was established in 2008. So the soil type at these experiments, it's loamy sand, which is representative of the processing vegetable industry that we have a lot in southwestern Ontario. So Witchdown site, we have fairly good weather conditions in terms of crop growth and yield. So we have about 3,300 crop yield units. The experiment has about 5 cover crop treatments consisting of a no cover crop control, oats, radish, cereal rye, and a mixture of radish and rye. So these experiments have been ongoing since 2007 at one site, and then 2008 at the adjacent site. So we have been doing a lot of soil health measurements, crop yield measurements from these experiments, and have been publishing a lot as well. So in terms of the cover crop management, I'll talk about the crop rotation that we have at this site. So it's a long-term experiment. So the cover crops, they're usually planted in the summer or the fall after harvesting the main crop that we have in the rotation. And again, the timing of cover crop planting, it depends upon the main crop that's planted in the rotation. When is it harvested? So we plant the cover crops either in summer if it's a winter wheat, but if it's corn, or if it's soybean, then we normally, or if it's another vegetable crop, we mostly plant it during the fall season after the crops they're harvested. And we leave the cover crops to overwinter. Some of these species, for example, cereal rye, it survives the winter. So we terminate it in the following spring using glyphosate. So before we plant the main crop in the next spring season, we terminate these cover crops using glyphosate, usually terminated around beginning of May, or beginning of May, and then we do a tillage to incorporate the crop residue, and then we prepare the crop for the next main crop. So since the 2007 and 2008, since the establishment of this experiment, so the crop rotation at this particular site consists of processing vegetable crops. So we have some processing peas, tomatoes, sweet corn, squash. We also have some grain corn, soybeans, winter wheat. So those are the main crops that we have been growing in this rotation since the establishment of the experiment, as you can see in this picture here. So from 2007 up until 2021, we have grown cover crops roughly about 10 times in those 13 years. And we also, during the experiment, we also have soil sample, and we have published those results. So for this presentation, I'm focusing on the results, soil results that we have sampled in 2015 from one experimental site in 2016 that was an adjacent experimental site, and also in 2019 the soil sample. So those will be the years that I will be presenting in terms of the soil health data, mostly particularly focusing on the soil organic carbon and soil organic matter. So when we soil sampled in 2015 and from the adjacent site in 2016, so we looked at about, in that particular time point, the cover crops were grown 6 times in about 8 years. So we looked at the concentration of organic carbon and also at the organic carbon storage due to these cover crops. So we found that at both sites, the cover crops, they had significantly greater carbon storage than the no cover crop control. So we found that cover crops, they had roughly about 11 to 22% greater organic carbon storage than the no cover crop control. And this was when cover crops were grown 6 times over the 8-year time period. So this data was collected in 2015 from one site, that's site A in this graph, and from 2016, that's site B in this graph. So this work was published in Nature Scientific Reports. So we published the organic carbon storage and how the cover crops, they impacted the economic returns in our crop rotation. We also did some correlations and regression analysis to understand the relationship between the organic carbon and the tomato yield, and just to understand if organic carbon can be used as an indicator of, predicting the future crop yields or as an indicator of agro-ecosystem resiliency. So we found that in 1 year, in 2015, there wasn't a significant relationship between organic carbon and the crop yield that was the processing tomatoes at that time in 2015. So the main crop that was grown in 2015 at site A and 2016 at site B were processing tomatoes. So we found that in 1 year, we did not find a significant relationship between the yield and the organic carbon concentration. But in the next year, in 2016, we found that there was a significant relationship between the carbon concentration and the crop yield. The important thing to mention here is that in 2016, we had a really hot and dry growing season. So the benefits of these cover crops on the soil health, they really showed up. So which made us realize that, okay, so the cropping system is getting more resilient when you have more adverse weather conditions. So you're not losing the crop yields. You're able to sustain the crop yields even when you have adverse weather conditions. So we had better yields with better soil health. So that was an important finding from this experiment. In 2015, we did not have that adverse weather conditions as compared to 2016. So yeah, that's what we concluded here. And yeah, here also the cover crops were grown 6 times in 8 years because this data is also from 2015 and 2016. So coming back to this picture, now let's talk about the soil health or the soil organic matter concentration that we measured in 2019. So in that particular time, the cover crops were grown 10 times over those 13 years. So we like the Soil Health Institute, they sampled our experimental sites, and in 2019, they evaluated the organic matter concentration in our experimental plots from 4 cover crop treatments. So they did not include oats in their measurements. So the treatments that they sampled were the no cover crop control, cereal rye, mixture of radish and rye, and oilseed radish. So in this particular case, the cover crops were grown 9 times in 12 years. So this data is from 2019. So we found that the cover crops, they had greater organic matter than the no cover crop control, which was pretty consistent with what we observed in 2019 as well, or in 2015 as well. So you can see here that oilseed radish had significantly greater organic matter percentage than the no cover crop control out of all these cover crop treatments. Similar to what we did in 2015 and 2016, we really wanted to understand, okay, can we use this organic matter data as an indication of agro-ecosystem resiliency and how these cover crops, they are contributing to that. So we found that the grain corn yield, there was a significant relationship between the organic matter and the grain corn yield. So that made us to conclude that we can use organic matter as an indication to predict the future crop yields. And when you have higher organic matter concentration, you are getting higher crop yields. So organic matter is really supporting this hypothesis of related to increased agro-ecosystem resiliency. So other thing that I would like to point out is that when we had grain corn in 2019, so in the beginning, the growing season was really hot and dry, similar to what we observed in 2016. So we had really low precipitation, which might have negatively impacted the crop yield if we did not have enough organic matter concentration in our soils. But because of this long-term cover cropping, we were able to sustain the crop yields and were able to obtain a really significant and strong relationship of this organic matter concentration with the crop yields. So we did not see a decrease in crop yield despite adverse weather conditions. And then this picture is from the grain corn that's been planted in 2021. So you can see in the background here is the grain corn that's from the no cover crop, planted in the no cover crop control treatment. And in the front is the grain corn that's planted in the cover crop plots. So here we applied starter fertilizer nitrogen to the corn in 2020. So you can see there was some visual differentiation between the corn plants. Then when at harvest, we also could see there was significant differences in the plants which were grown in the no cover crop controls versus the plants which were grown in the cover crop plots. in 2021. So this picture was taken in September. So the grain corn that's in the long-term cover crops is significantly higher than the grain corn that's in the no cover crops. We also found visual differences in the kernel size of the corn. So you can see in the picture on the right here that the corn that's from the cobs that are from the long-term cover crop plots, they had, the sizes, it's bigger compared to the no cover crop plots. So we were seeing some visual differences in the plant health, as well as in the plant size, plant height, plant vigor. Everything was being impacted by these long-term cover crops. Then we looked at the crop yield in both years, in 2020 and 2021. So this graph demonstrates the crop yields. So the white bars are from 2020 and the gray bars are from 2021. So you can see that relative to the no cover crop control, in 2020, oilseed radish had significantly greater crop yield than the no cover crop control. And in 2021, the trends were pretty similar. So again, oilseed radish had significantly greater crop yield than the no cover crop. And the results were consistent with what we observed in terms of organic matter concentration as well. So oilseed radish had greater organic matter concentration in the previous years as well, which might have been reflected in the increased crop yields from these plots as well. So overall, the yield, we observed the yield increases by up to 38 to 59 bushels per acre from in the grain corn when we collected the crop yield data in 2020 and 2021 due to these long-term cover crops. So at this particular experiment, overall, looking since from the beginning of this experiment in 2007 up until 2021, we have planted the cover crops over about 165 times. And 163 times we found that the crop yields were either equal to or they were better than the no cover crop control. So that was a pretty significant finding. And as I mentioned earlier, we have published the results and have presented the results at numerous meetings and also in the scientific articles. In addition to these long-term experiments at Ridgetown, we also have some other long-term experimental sites in Ontario. So the other experimental site that I'm going to talk a little bit about here today is the Elora. So we have a University of Guelph experimental plots at Elora as well. So the Ridgetown site, in addition to the long-term cover crop plots at Ridgetown, we have another experimental site that's also a long-term experimental site, but it does not only include the cover crops, it includes red clover, winter wheat, alfalfa that's being added to the corn soil rotation. So those two experimental sites, they look at the long-term effects of crop rotation, diversification, tillage, and also nitrogen fertilizer application on the crop yields and also on the soil health parameters. So the Witchdown site was established in 1995 at a clay loam soil type with about 3,300 crop heat units, whereas the Elora site was established in 1980. The soil type at that particular site is silty loam, and we have about 2,700 crop heat units. So the nitrogen fertilizer treatment that I mentioned earlier is only at Ridgetown. At Elora, we only have crop rotation and tillage treatments. So I'm going to give a brief description about the Witchdown site. So we have long-term tillage, crop rotation, and nitrogen experiment that's been ongoing at Ridgetown. So we receive about 870 millimeters of total annual rainfall. So this site, as I mentioned earlier, was initiated in 1995. So we have 7 crop rotations consisting of monoculture corn, monoculture soybean, corn soil rotation, and then diversification of corn soil rotations with winter wheat, with red clover, and then corn soy winter wheat rotation that's undersown with red clover. So in terms of tillage, we have conventional moldboard plow and no tillage treatments. We also have nitrogen fertilizer treatment at the Witchdown site. The other experimental site is at Elora. So at Elora, it's received about 900 millimeters of total annual precipitation. This site was established in 1980, and we have about 8 different crop rotations consisting of monoculture corn, soybean rotations, and then diversification of those rotations with cover crops such as oats, barley, small grain cereals, the winter wheat, and also perennial crop that's alfalfa. We have 2 tillage treatments similar to what we have Ridgetown, consisting of conventional and no tillage. We do not have nitrogen fertilizer treatment at Elora. So what are the benefits of including these small grain cereals, red clover, alfalfa in the crop rotation? So previous research that's been conducted at these sites and also elsewhere, they have shown that including these crops in the crop rotations over time have contributed to improved soil quality, increased organic carbon status, and also increased total nitrogen. We have also recently published the work from these 2 experimental sites, and we also observed improved soil quality and improved organic carbon concentration when we have these crops in the crop rotation. And we have also observed that when you have winter wheat and red clover in the crop rotations, in addition to soil health, you also get benefits in terms of improved crop yield. So for corn, there has been studies which have demonstrated that the crop yield increases by about 15%, whereas for soybean, it's about 13% yield increases they have been observed. So from these particular sites from Ridgetown and Elora, so we sampled in 2016. We observed the soil and crop sampled in 2016. So we observed the effects of crop rotation, diversification, tillage, and also nitrogen fertility on the crop yield in 2016. So in this graph, you can see how the crop rotation diversification, it impacted the crop yields. So this is the corn yield, the green bars. The blue is the soybean yield, and the orange is the winter wheat yield. So we found significantly greater corn yield when we had corn soybean rotation when it was diversified by including winter wheat and also the red clover. So there was about 11.6% increase or greater yield from corn, soy, winter wheat rotation undersown with red clover than the monoculture corn. For soybean and winter wheat, we did not find significant differences between the crop rotations or among the crop rotations, but there were numerically greater increases when we had diversified the crop rotation with winter wheat and red clover. And at Elora, we found that the corn yield was about 34% greater when we had alfalfa in the crop rotation than the monoculture corn. Whereas for soybean, we did not find significant differences even when we diversified the corn soy rotation with winter wheat or with the red clover. And this data was collected in 2016. We also evaluated the soil organic carbon concentration from these crop rotations at both sites. And we found that this soybean wheat rotation that was undersown with red clover had the greatest organic carbon concentration and was significantly greater than the corn, soy, monoculture corn and monoculture soy rotation. This was from Ridgetown. Again, the data was collected in 2016 from the surface soil. And at Elora, we observed that the corn rotation, when it was when we included small grain cereals such as oats, barley, red clovers, and also the perennial crops such as alfalfa to this monoculture corn, we observed greater organic carbon concentrations than the monoculture corn and also than the continuous corn soy rotation. So these led us to conclude that more you have these living roots in the soil or the inclusion of these winter weeds, perennial crops such as alfalfa. They help to contribute more plant carbon inputs into the soil, which was contributing to an increased organic carbon concentration in our soils over time. So it's really about the it's related to the type of the crop, but also related to the living roots that are present in the soil, which is really beneficial for increasing the carbon concentrations in our soil, which was also reflected in increased crop yields from these experimental plots. With this, I would like to acknowledge the people who contributed to this work and the funding organizations consisting of Green Farmers of Ontario, Ontario Processing Vegetable Growers, Seed Corn Growers of Ontario, and the OMAFRA funding, and also the federal grants. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? I have one. I'm just kind of interested to see the oilseed radish seemed to contribute to increased yield.
Yeah,
it seemed like it was much higher than I thought, based on oilseed radish don't just seem to be a big carbon source.
yeah, I know. Yeah, that was yes, I agree. So you're talking about carbon, right?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, this one here, right?
yeah.
Yeah, yes. So yeah, this data was in 2019 from the surface soil. Yeah, yeah. The data was collected by the Soil Health Institute, and I think they collected it during the spring season before we planted the main crop in 2019. Yeah. But the remaining measurements that I've shown here, we have collected, mostly the data was collected at the crop harvest. So.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. When were oilseed radish, oats, and rye seeded? Same dates for each species?
Yes. Yeah. And what crashed crop did those crops follow? So it depended upon the crop rotation. So we had different crops going on in the crop rotation. So it was either after the processing tomatoes or squash or soybeans or winter wheat. So it depended upon the main crop that was grown in the rotation. What was the sampling depth for the SOC? So yeah, it's a surface soil. So we collected from 0 to 15 centimeters.
Any other questions from the participants? One just
Yeah.
came in from Larry.
How did tillage impact soil carbon? Yeah, so tillage has some negative implications, like depending upon the tillage you're talking about. So if it's conventional tillage, we have seen that we expect theoretically that, like when you till the soil, you're breaking the aggregates, and whatever carbon is in the soil, you're making it available to the microorganisms. So there's a greater potential for mineralization of carbon and loss of carbon from the soils. Whereas when you no-till the soil, you are not disturbing the soil. The carbon that's in the soil remains intact, and it's over time it gets preserved in more protected forms of carbon. So you tend to expect the benefits or increased carbon storage when you have no tillage versus the conventional tillage.
Another question came in from Dean.
What population was the radishes planted? Oh, I don't have it on the top of my head, but I can definitely get back to you with the data. So
These were all as single species.
Yes.
No multiple species.
These were single species. We only had one mixture that was radish and rye, but everything else was single.
Any other questions? If not, could you quit sharing your screen? Yeah. And I will share mine.
Yeah.
And we will now break into our discussion groups and just kind of some guidelines just to discuss the topic. What's your impressions? How can we use this research to learn any topics for future webinars? We'd be grateful for that. And then I'd like to thank again everyone for joining us today. Join us next month, April 20th. Brian Doherty's going to be talking about the Soil Health Matrix. It's a new tool. It's going to be kind of an introduction of a new tool that we're pretty excited about, and we hope everybody can join us next month. So Brian, we put a lot of work in this to join us to have the introduction to see how it might be a useful tool. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and thank you for presenting, Dr. Chahal, and we will go into our breakout room for additional discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much.